All right, so we're gonna get started. So this section is a little bit different in that, we aren't, just talking about KQL anymore. We're actually getting down to the cybersecurity part. So in this section, we start with a tweet from Katie Dimes. And Katie Dimes is a researcher on Twitter who tweets that users should check their logs, or companies should check their logs for malicious file name being used to target research organization. And the file name is research bibliography generator.zip. At this point, we don't really know anything about this indicator, which is a file name, but we want to try to use that to answer a couple questions. A, figure out if this is something that impacts our organization, whether or not we have any data on this particular threat. And B, see if using the data that we have available to us, we can build out more information about the cluster that this activity is a part of if it does impact us. We also want to know about what is the impact to our organization, what mitigation steps we should take. Should we apply for user box? Do we set up a full IR, right? Do we want to have a full incident response process and not sleep for the next 2 to 3 weeks? Or is this something simple like someone tried to phish us with an email and nothing happened? Right. This is actually pretty common. A lot of the work that we do on Twitter is on Twitter. I mean, we get a lot of good intel from Twitter, which is a cool way to say that when I'm checking Twitter while I'm at work, I can explain it away to my boss. No, but seriously, we do get a lot of cool stuff on Twitter. People do share really good and really interesting content that we actually use to inform some of the work that we do. So we have a file name, right? And I want to figure out how we can make use of. So the questions have been set up in a way that guides you through how you should think about the pivoting process. One thing to note is that there are so many different ways you can pivot about using an indicator. Emily and I and Greg and I, very, very different ways of pivoting, very different ways about moving, right? I'll have, this is my process and this is how I like to think about it. And they'll say, you're kind of a madman, right? I like to think about it this completely different way, right? But all those are valid as long as you are methodical in terms of how you think about it and how you dice it. And you're making correct or good and valid pivots, because some pivots are bad pivots. But as long as you're making them, how you go about making them is really, really up to you. And sometimes it's up to the role that you're in, right? Like if you're in an intel role, you have your priority is about collecting information versus if you're an IR, you're thinking about impact organization. So, if I'm in an IR role, I don't necessarily care about related activity. I care about stopping the bleeding first. Versus if I'm in intel, I'm like la di da di da. I just want to find out more about the actor. And I don't really care about stopping the bleeding because there is no bleeding from my perspective. If you're still seeing the Matthew Kennedy tweet, you may need to just close your browser and try the KC7 ak.ms/KC7 guide. All right, let's get started. Question number 1, which user has a file name? I'm not going to go through all the questions. I'm going to skip around a little bit, but I just want to talk through the general process of how we go through it. Which user has a file name research bibliography generator.zip on their machine? I'm going to go back to the data set, and one thing we'll notice is that I have all these table here. If you remember, we had a table that shows us in a guide what all the different data sets mean, or what kind of information that they contain. We'll see that we have a file creation events table that tells us what information or different hosts in the organization. So I'm going to do a take 10 on that table, and I want to see that it has information about the host name, the SHA-256, which is a unique identifier for a file, the path on the machine, the file name, and the size. So this is probably has a field name here. This will probably be a good way to find the file that we're looking for. So I'm going to say file creation events where file name
Hey, Simeon?
equal to, yes.
I think you need to switch to security logs too really quick.
That's a setup. See, thanks for looking out. Thanks for looking out. All right. In fact, make sure you're on security logs too, because that'll mess you up. So we find the file research bibliography generator.zip, and it's on this machine DLY5-desktop. So the question was, which user has this file name? Well, we have a host name, but we don't necessarily know who it is. So again, whenever we want to know who, we can connect back to the employees table. So we can say employees where host name is equal to that. And the user here is Terry Simpson at involvedlab.com. So I can take this And I can go back to my challenge. And hopefully I got this answer right. I'm not in the correct account. You didn't see any of that. Look away. And the answer is Terry Simpson, but it's already been answered. All right. Question number 2, right? And again, we now know whose machine was infected. So there's a couple ways you could go depending on what's your approach. You can figure out, ask the question, okay, well, how did the file end up on the user's machine? Like, how the heck did they get there? Or you can go the other way. You can ask yourself, what happened after the file got on the user's machine? Again, talking when we're like making the questions, Emily's approach was, I want to figure out where the bleeding is. I want to figure out what happens afterwards. Me, I'm more of a laissez-faire guy. I like to figure out, how the heck did this email get here and what upstream indicators can we block to prevent this from happening again. In this case, we're asking you when the user we're actually going we're going backwards in time. We're saying, okay, when did the user above download researchbibliographygenerator.com? We're talking downloads, right? So download means somebody clicked a link and browsed out to the internet. And how we figure out what websites people are browsing. We talked about this a couple of times before. We're going to figure that out in the outbound browsing table. We'll do a take 10, and there's a URL field to figure out what websites people are browsing to. So I would expect that if someone clicked on a link with that file name will be somewhere in the URL that they browse to. So I will say outbound browsing, where URL has not Terry Simpson, but researchbibliographygenerator.zip. And we see that someone did browse to a URL, disembark-remarkable.science on January 7th at 1324, and they have this source IP. I would wager to say it is also Terry Simpson, who is this person. And we can try that. We can say employees where email address is equal to that. But that's not an email address, that's an IP address.
IP address.
Yes, exactly. I knew that. All right, so it is Terry Simpson who did click on the link. When they click on that link, it was at January. It says when? Yeah, it was on January 7th at 1324. So at about 1:24 p.m. So slightly before the file was found on disk. Okay, so there's a couple questions now that lead us down a rabbit hole.
One thing, Simeon, to jump in on. So, part of being a good analyst is that we have to contextualize data. So let's just go back and look at what Simeon looked at quickly. Let's pull up the query for the first question. Yeah, go ahead and run that. Okay, so what are we looking for here? We've got this file name that we know is bad. Someone on Twitter said it's bad, right? When we take open source information, let's not take it word for word. Let's do our own analysis, but we think it's bad. So we looked in our table that contains information about files being created on hosts, right? So we shouldn't think about this as just, oh, okay, here's a row in a table that does blah, 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 there's some file name, right? Like this is a file that we suspect is malicious and it was downloaded to Terry Simpson's system. So let's contextualize what we're looking at in this table and understand what it actually means. So like Simeon talked us through, now let's think backwards. If it got on his system, something happened that made it show up there, right? It didn't just appear out of thin air. So did he download it from the internet? Was it transmitted from a USB device that he plugged in? Right? We don't know. Let's make a hypothesis. Maybe he downloaded it. So that's when we go and we look at our browsing logs. Did we see someone in the company, especially Terry, who clicked on a link that took him to this malicious file? And sure enough, we see it. We also saw that the timestamps aligned. So as we're moving around in different data sets, we have to keep that context in mind. And we're constantly building a story in our head. So if your boss came in and interrupted you at this point in your investigation and said, what have you found? You're not going to say, well, I looked in the file creation events table and I looked for this file name and I saw that it had this file hash and it was tied to this host name. Like, they don't care, right? You want to be able to tell that story. not only to someone else, but to yourself, so you can kind of keep yourself on track with the investigation.
Yeah, it's important to build that context around what you are looking for. And normally what we do is we document what we're looking at over time, because you want to start to build a story of, what am I looking at? Where am I in the story that I'm building? And what information am I still missing, right? Because at a certain point you have something, but you're still missing information, right? In the real world, your boss is breathing down your neck and saying, if you're working in the SOC, and saying, hey, someone downloaded a file that could be potentially malicious. So you have to figure out, okay, what don't I know? Is the file actually malicious or is it not? How did it get there? What did the user do? How did they, is it targeted? Did they get it by accident? What is happening? And so we're trying to build out all those questions. So here's what we know: a malicious file is on disk for Terry Simpson. Terry Simpson downloaded the file They clicked a link that got them to the file. And the question we want to ask, of course, is, well, what the heck? How the heck did they get the link? In this case, we're gonna guess that maybe they clicked the link. They didn't just directly browse to it. They clicked the link via an email, right? And so the question asks you, when did the user receive an email containing a link to that file name? And we can do pretty much the same thing we did in the last question, where we can go to the email table, do a take 10, realize that if this user did receive an email, then maybe that email or that file name will be inside of the link. So we can probably cheat, right? This is a pretty small company, and we can say, hey, just give me all the emails that Terry received, and then we can see if we can eyeball it. Well, here there's 12. And we can see right at the bottom, there's this research bibliography generated. That's it. But I'm cheating because the data set is so small. In the real world, it won't be so small that you can just cheat and get that. So we can just look in the link column and say where a link has research bibliography generator. That's it. And the advantage of doing it this way is that you can maybe discover other users that received other emails with this file name, right? That might be of interest to you. So in this case, we realized that she received it at 1:07:13:21. And we have a couple additional questions which fan out on who was the email sent by, what other domains were used to deliver links via email. We want to pay attention to, okay, there's a couple interesting things here that now that we found the email. One, there's a science theme to the domain, right? Disembark, remarkable, that's science, right? I asked earlier about thinking about the themes that you're looking at, right? Is this accidental? What are the traits of the adversary? What are the things that they're intentionally doing? What are the things that they're doing that they don't know that they're doing? And how can we use all these to try to cluster and define that actor based on the diamond model? We see the sender is a John and John Moderno at yahoo.com. Maybe John and John it alludes to Johnson and Johnson. Maybe Moderno is just the misspelling of Moderna, like the vaccine company. We see vaccine journal at yahoo.com. What is the subject, right? The subject is research opportunities, right? Apply today. So something appealing to someone at Involved Labs who's a researcher who might be more likely to click on it as a result. So we have all these things, right? And these things are all, indicators that we can use to pivot out and start to build our cluster. So what's the next question asking us? Who was the email sent by? What was the subject? What other domains were? Okay, so these two are pretty easy. The email was sent by Johnson & Johnson. The subject is research opportunities. And then it asks us, well, what other emails were sent by emails with this subject? And this is an important point right here. We're about to do something called pivoting. You've already done it by accident, but this is a very fundamental concept to analysis and to threat intelligence. Pivoting is the concept through which you use one piece of information that you have, and you can use it across two data sets. You can use that one piece of information you have, go to a different data set, you pivot to a different data set so that you can learn some novel information that you didn't before. And so here we have an adversary that's using a subject research opportunities applied today. I'm looking at this, and as an analyst, I'm saying, hey, if I were to pivot on this particular subject, I might be able to find additional emails associated with this particular actor, assuming that this is a unique subject that my actor likes to reuse. And again,
Right.
that's
So
a hypothesis. A hypothesis, as Greg said earlier.
one thing on that, Simeon. So we're basically part of analysis, we're giving you these guiding questions that make it much less likely that you will guess incorrectly. But a key part of analysis is you are going to make assumptions. You're going to make hypotheses, and you will test them. And more often than not, they fail, right? So we're making a guess here. Maybe this actor used the same subject line multiple times, right? And even better yet, maybe they use the same subject line with different email addresses. So we can actually pivot on a subject line and find more emails that they're using, right? We don't know if that's the case just yet. It's just a guess. So let's see if that's true.
And it looks like it's true, right? We see 4 emails that were delivered by actually the same sender, right? 2 different reply tos to 4 different users using the same subject. If we look at the links, we see that they have a new domain and a new file name, right? So this is a based on the information that we have here, right? We can make an assessment that this additional information is likely associated. Why? Because the sender is the same, the reply to fits the same theme, the file names, the links, the file names seem to fit the same vaccine theme. We could be wrong, and the link seems to be of a same size theme, right? So we're using all these different things to make an assessment that this is likely related, and that we want to continue down this path, right? Because if at this point, if we made a bad pivot, we will go down a rabbit hole of like more and more and more wrong stuff, right? And you wouldn't know until like you're like 10 layers deep. I want to pause here and I want to go back for a second. And Greg made a really good point about we are making guesses about what's going to be a good pivot, what's going to be a bad pivot. And that's something that you kind of tune over time. You tune your intuition over time to how you do that. Let's think about what would be a bad pivot in this case, right? Let's say, for example, I try to say, hey, I'm going to pivot on the domain of the sender here on yahoo.com because I assume that I saw a bad guy with @yahoo.com sending an email, and so all other emails coming from @yahoo.com must be bad, right? That's my hypothesis, and that's what I'm going to pivot on. And so I say I'm going to pivot on the sender domain. I'm going to say email where sender has yahoo.com. Does anyone want to help me tell me whether or not I made a good pivot or a bad pivot, and how do I know?
There's no
Okay.
wrong answers here, right? What
No
do you
wrong
think?
answers, yeah.
So to recap, what Simeon has done, we had the bad file name. We found it in email, and we saw that whoever sent this bad file name, they were using a Yahoo email account. So Simeon made the hypothesis that our actor is using Yahoo accounts. And so he's looking for all the Yahoo emails sent to our organization. So is this a good pivot? Will this help us find more actor activity? Or is this a bad pivot that's going to show us some unrelated stuff?
Well, I'd wager that it's probably not. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a bad one because there will be several records with yahoo.com, and that may lead to some level of confusion. So making it difficult to really trace down who the actor is.
Yeah, exactly. So Yahoo is a free mail provider. Anybody in the world can use Yahoo. Our adversary is using Yahoo, but a lot of people that work with Involved Labs probably also use Yahoo accounts. So unless we're adding this on top of other indicators that we saw, we're just going to generate a lot of noise, and we're going to end up tagging a lot of different things that have no relationship with the actor as actor related, which is going to really muddy the analysis that we're doing. So again,
Yeah, and let's do a quick intuition check here too. So Simeon, pull up the where Link has research bibliography generator. Okay, so this is our known bad. This is all we know right now, right? We talked about these themes: vaccine journal, disarm remarkable .science, Johnson and Johnson Moderno at yahoo.com. Everything here, research opportunities is the subject line. Everything here points to research, medicine, science, right? And we know that we're a pharmaceutical company. So that's all the evidence we have so far related to this actor falls within that topic area. So now if we go back and look at the results of the Yahoo sender check, Emily, what do we see here?
So much stuff. It's not all related to medical stuff. We see camcorders. We see procurement. We see investments. A lot of stuff that doesn't relate to our theme, our TTPs of our actor. I think one thing that's also important to highlight here is that the pivot, the reason that this pivot might have been a bad pivot isn't because it gave us unrelated results by itself. If you do a pivot, and let's say that you pivoted on the subject line and you had gotten 10 emails back, and you could scroll through with your eyes and 8 of them were by the same sender, but 2 of them seem unrelated, that's still a good pivot. And that's where threat intelligence analysis comes in. So that's just something I want to mention here. Like, we're doing data manipulation, we're hunting through the data. And when we're talking here about the theme, part of why that's so important, part of why these TTPs, we're talking about the actor using the vaccine theme, the science medical theme, is so that when you do a pivot that's only, let's say, 80% effective, you have enough of an understanding of that actor and their TTPs, which is tactics, techniques, and procedures. You have enough of that understanding built out that you can understand which results may or may not be related. Because if you wrote your query too narrow, you might miss some important related results. So sometimes it's okay to pivot out to something bigger and then narrow down that result so you just get down to what you need. In this case, the reason this pivot wasn't great is because we've kind of flipped. We've flipped the triangle on its head, let's say, to where the vast majority of results are unrelated, and we only have a couple that are. Scrolling through, we can see most of these don't relate back. So that means yahoo.com is not specific enough as a TTP, like, to just our actor to help us build out our understanding of that one actor. So bad results, not necessarily a bad thing. So many bad results that you can't even figure out what you're looking at. Probably time to back out of that pivot and think, okay, what else do I know about this actor so I can pivot into something a little bit more specific?
Exactly. That's a really good explanation here. So we're able to pivot on the FDA, the interview theme, but really we could pivot on any of these things, right? I can pivot on the sender, so I can say where sender is equal to, right, Johnson & Johnson, John & John Moderna, which we saw earlier. And then we can pivot on all these replied to because the adversary may have reused these, right? We can pivot on the file name, right? So we can say where a link ends with FDA notice at docx, right? And then we have additional reply tos and additional senders and additional domains that we can use, right? So there's so many different pivot opportunities. And really the point of this is that, at any given point, you can keep making pivots. And as you keep making pivots, you will start to build a list of indicators and TTPs that your adversary is using, right? A list of, infrastructure. So my adversary uses this domain and this IP, and this domain is associated with this IP, which is associated with this file name. So you start building this graph in your head or on paper of all the things that your adversary is doing, and then you can have a trail, right, of how did I find this thing, right? You should have a trail of how it ultimately relates back to the first indicator that you have, which is that file name, right? So anything inside your cluster, you will say, hey, I can show the relationship all the way back, all the pivots I made all the way back to the original thing. And if you can't show that relationship, right, it could be that you find something that's bad along the way. And you have to answer the question, well, yes, it's bad. Is it related to my original thing, right? If you can't answer that question, it may just be something else entirely, which is a distinction that we have to make in threat intel, right? You could make a bad pivot that could end you up on a different cluster, but that is still bad. But when we're talking about attribution, it's important for us to make that surgical difference because attribution determines intentions and outcomes for our organization. So it's important for us to figure out, who's doing it and why they're doing it, and differentiate between those intentions.
So,
All right.
Simeon, could we do just a couple, just for reference for everyone, we will be sending out an answer key following the session. It's going to give you not only the answers to all the questions in the guide, but also the KQL that you would use to answer the question. So we don't want to go verbatim through the rest of the questions just for time's sake. We're coming up on just 30 minutes left. Simeon, let's do a few pivots so when we talk about a cluster of activity, right? We're not talking about an ADX cluster. We're talking about a cluster of intrusion activity. We're seeing badness in our logs, and we want to expand out and see what we can find. So Simeon, let's do a few pivots and let's write some stuff down. Let's write down some of the domains we're finding. Let's write down some of these emails. And then we're going to go back to the diamond model that we talked about way at the beginning of the session and start to talk about how each of these pieces fit into the diamond model.
All right. So we have some file names, right? I'm going to do several categories of things, right? I'm going to take some notes here. Say I want to take a note for file names I'm seeing. I want to take a notes for IPs. I'm going to take domain names, senders. What else am I missing? Maybe,
I think that's good. We could get a little more advanced and talk like post-compromise TTPs as well, like what's happening after the malware shows up, but we'll get there in a minute.
All right, so let's start from the scratch. So we're going to say, hey, we have a file name here, which is researchbibliography.zip. That's the original one that we had. And we pivot over to emails. We saw that it was sent by Johnson & Johnson with this mismatching reply to address. So both of these appear to be, we're going to make somewhat a low confidence assessment that both of these are related. I will say that they have the same theme, so I would give it a little bit more confidence, medium confidence that they're related based on what we see here. We also have a subject that we can pivot on, and then we have a domain that we can pivot on as well. Okay, cool. All right, so let's do a pivot. We're going to pivot first on the let's pivot on the subject. So we'll see we're subject equal to research opportunities applied today. And then we have one new sender, journal at protonmail.com, right? So I'm building part of a cluster. What do I see here? I don't see any new subjects because that's what we're pivoted on. We see one new domain that I can make a note of. And then I can see one new file name, vaccinesafety.rar.
So what Simeon's doing, because it's instinct more or less when you've done this a lot, but we're looking for things we didn't already know, right? That's what you said. Okay, here's a domain I haven't already seen. Here's a file name I haven't already seen. And he's constantly doing sort of an intuition check. Does this seem in line with everything else I've seen from this actor? And you might be thinking like, oh, this is a game, like you're making this stuff look really simple so it stands out. In reality, sometimes this kind of stuff is this obvious, right?
Yeah.
You find a domain that your actor is using. You find 15, 20 emails that they're using to send that bad domain. They're all similar looking. They imitate, people that work in a certain sector, or they imitate like security alert themes. This is super, super realistic. This is often how the data looks in the real world.
Exactly. Let's do a couple more pivots. So let's say our file name is vaccine safety info.rar, right? What am I learning anything new here? This is a dead end pivot. I didn't learn anything new. So I'll try something else. I'll say, okay, well, let's say where sender is equal to this. This was a reply to address that I saw that was new, and I want to see if they're using it to send anything else. Okay, well, here I get one new reply to, again, still research team. I get a new subject line, still COVID related, and I get one new file name, again, still somewhat research themed. So I'll note that. I can pivot on the subject again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot into passive DNS to get some IPs that I don't already have. So I'll say passive DNS where domain and I have two IPs that I can put as part of my cluster. And then I can pivot on these two IPs again. I'm going to use a let statement. On distinct the IPs. We'll have a list of two IPs after I distinct. I'm going kind of fast here, and that's because we're trying to get to the end. But I'm just really illustrating what the process is for me as an analyst. Distinct IP, and then I'm going to go back into the passive DNS table where IP in IPs to find additional domains. And here I find vaccine.science, which it already didn't have. And then one thing cool about passive DNS is I'm going to go back into the same data source and say, hey, are there any additional domains IPs that I didn't know about associated with this? So I'll say let domains is equal to this distinct domain, then error. So I took my original domain, right? I looked for IPs associated with that. I found the domains associated with those IPs. I'm looking for new domains associated with those. In this case, I'm somewhat at a dead end in terms of passive DNS, and that's okay. But I did find one new domain. Sometimes you'll find that you find a whole cluster of, maybe 30, 40 domains associated with this. But at this point, we're at a dead end. What I can do is take this new domain that I found. I can go back into email and I can say where link has this, which I don't find anything, but that's okay. But the idea is that I'm building this list of infrastructure and TTPs that my adversary is using. So I have a list of IPs that they bought at some hosting provider, a list of domain names that they registered. I have a list of sender email addresses that they went to yahoo.com and registered, and I have a list of subjects and file names that they have. And I can keep on building this into a large graph of all the things that are related that I cluster together. And what I want to do sometimes is compare that with other things that I know about using the diamond model. So Greg, do you want to jump to the final portion and show why this matters a little bit? We haven't gotten to the file stuff. I don't know if we're trying to expedite it a little bit too fast. Maybe we'll just show demonstratively. This part we're going at like 50x. We're gonna go a little bit accelerated, but it's just to demonstrate the power of this data and the power of like how this really resembles the work that we do.
Yeah. So Simeon, why don't you show quickly, just like on the lead that you're on right now, let's get to an endpoint and show like what's happening.
All right. So let's go back to the original endpoint that we had for that we had the file on where Terry Simpson was. And we're going to ask the question that Emily would have asked initially, right? Because, probably what I should have asked if I was in the SOC and I was trying to figure out for bleeding, what actually happened on the box, as opposed to like going on all these like frivolous goose chases. I'm going to go in the file creation alerts. and say, okay, well, what is happening on the box where host name is equal to that. And I can
And as
see
a reminder,
that
we got this because we had that tweet with the original file name, and we looked here first, right? This was question number 1
Exactly.
in section 2. So this is that employee's computer, Terry Simpson's computer.
Right. So we're starting at the beginning again, but we're going the other way, right? I started at the beginning. I found who the user that was compromised. I'm going the other way and figuring out what's actually happening on that box. Again, the question that Emily would have asked. And I see that they downloaded the file at on the same day, 13/24. But what we see is that right after that, there's a file that got dropped a couple seconds later called updater.dll. That may be suspicious, but we don't really know until we need some other evidence. And so what we can actually do is we can go into process events and see what actually happened on the box around that time to see if that updater.dll is suspicious. And what we see here is that we see the updater.dll. Bear with us if you're not very technical. We're getting really into like more technical things here. So it's okay. We're just kind of demonstrating what the power of the data is here, right? No need to yeah, it's okay if you're not keeping up. We're just demonstrating it. So we see this updater.dll. Okay, so they downloaded the file. The file dropped another file, a secondary file, right? Because we saw that file on the box immediately after the file that they downloaded. And now we see that command starting to do some enumerate some reconnaissance. So it's running who am I as it's in the parent process name. So it's spawning a who am I command. So it's trying to figure out what user's account they're on. And then they're running this updater.dll to an IP. And this is, if you follow the trail, you'll figure that this is an actor IP, but they're establishing a command and control channel back to the adversary, right? So adversary finally got a file, the file dropped an implant, and the attacker wants to connect back to their own infrastructure so they can issue a hands-on keyboard activity. So this is the end of the automated portion, right? So they deliver the malware, the user executes it. Now, right, the attacker gets to have some fun. You know, they're waiting at home somewhere when it eating some chips, watching Netflix, waiting for the user to click the file. User clicks the file, and they're like, oh shit, like finally it happened, right? Like I've been waiting, right? They're gonna get the alert that like the user clicked, you have established a tunnel. Now it's time to have fun. This is where all the good stuff begins, right? So now they actually get back on their keyboard. They're not watching Netflix anymore, and they go to town. And all these commands are no longer being executed by the malware. They're actually being manually executed by a human user on the keyboard. And so what do we see? We see right after that, we see the next day, right? So it took about a day for that for the attacker. Well, the attacker maybe went shopping, they went out with their friends, they came back the next day and they realized, oh look, one of my users got compromised. Let me go do some stuff. And so you see them executing a list of commands on the next day.
I think it's worth noting as well here that so far up until this point in our investigation, all of which was important, and Simeon's mentioned a few times, he would have gone the way we did, I would have gone this way. Both of us are right. Up until this point in time, we have been operating without knowledge that this is actually malicious. Somebody on Twitter told us malicious. There's a bunch of yahoos on Twitter, right? Like not everyone on Twitter is going to tell us the right thing. And by the same token, maybe we are looking at research bibliography generator.zip and someone in our company happened to be using a file of that exact same name because we didn't have a hash. So like we're not sure it's even the same file. Up until this very moment, everything was just suspicious. Everything was like, I mean, if you've worked in this industry literally at all, which all of us have, you looked at that and you knew it was bad, right? There's no like doubt, but we didn't have any evidence. Now we do. This is bad. This is actually malicious. So now we've confirmed what the person on Twitter had said, that it was actually malicious. And this is kind of where the investigation will take a turn. We're no longer just like investigating some suspicious activity. Badness has occurred and we've confirmed that suspicion. So that's like an important note.
Yeah, that's great, Emily. And that ties into another point, which is, analysis, threat intelligence, and just analysis in general is as much about figuring out what you know as it is figuring out what you don't know, right? So like for the entire first half of our investigation, we kept saying over and over, we don't actually know if this is malicious, but, right? So that context is important. You can't just assume things when you're talking about, we can make assumptions as we investigate, but when we talk about our findings, especially to an external audience, we can't just make assumptions that we can't substantiate with evidence. So we can make assessments, right? We don't always know everything. We weren't sitting in the room when the attacker opened a remote channel to this computer and stole credentials and exfiltrated sensitive data. But the data we do have suggests that that's what happened, right? So,
All right.
Simeon, you want a high-level overview of what we see here?
High level view, the attacker, went out with their friends. They came back the next day, realized that the user they sent the email to was compromised, and what they did was they dumped credentials on the victim system, right? So they can use that to log back into other computers. They copied files. This is a little bit exaggerated, right? That it doesn't actually look like this in real life. We exaggerate a little bit to make it obvious. They copied files from the user's documents folder over to an exfiltrate folder on the machine, and then they copy that out to Pastebin where they're going to download it on the other side. Sometimes attackers actually do name stuff like exfil or like this person's files, and that makes it very convenient for you, but not all the time. Sometimes they try to make it blend, and sometimes they're like, I stole files from Simeon.gzip. So that is exactly what happened in this case. So when we talk about the diamond model, right, what is the intent of the adversary who sent this email, right? They have a research team, but their intent is not to destroy files in this network. Their intent here is to steal files, right? And so that might tell you a little bit about, when we played that game of who done it, that might tell you a little bit about who it might be.